Take a look at these images of unrest in Bahrain. Protesters are chanting, "Down with the king, may God curse you, Hamad, and we will never be humiliated." Police respond by firing tear gas and making mass arrests. These images aren't from the Arab Spring protest in 2011. They're from the last few weeks. Today, we want to explore how protests in Bahrain are a byproduct of the war on Iran and what they mean. But before that, some context. Iran, in its retaliation against the US and Israel's war, has struck every single country in the Gulf. Bahrain is the only country where those attacks have sparked small but significant anti-government protests. Why is that? A large proportion of Bahrainis are Shia. Some ethnic groups in Bahrain were among the earliest adopters of Shia Islam dating back to the 7th century. Shia communities have long complained of discrimination in the country. Bahrain's ruling Al-Khalifa family, who are Sunni, have ruled the island since 1783. The Al-Khalifas have historically been supported by the West, first Britain and then the US. Bahrain is home to the US Navy's 5th Fleet, where 9,000 American troops are based. The presence of US troops has been a point of contention among Bahrainis for decades. Now, as Iran targets US bases across the region, that relationship has come into the spotlight once again. To find out why, I'm joined by Maryam al-Khawaja, a Bahraini activist who played a key role in the pro-democracy protests in Bahrain in 2011 and advocates for political reform. Maryam, thanks a lot for joining us. Now, I want to start off by asking...
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I want to start off by asking you, why has there been unrest in Bahrain over the past few days, and would people have taken to the streets if not for the war on Iran?
I mean, look, to understand what's happening in Bahrain, you also have to understand, as you mentioned, the historical context, right? I mean, the protests against the presence of foreign military bases is something that has been ongoing for decades in Bahrain. And it's the US base, it's the UK base, etc. And the political decisions that are made by the ruling family in Bahrain, which by a lot of indigenous people inside the country are considered occupiers, but given that they took over Bahrain by force, have been ruling by force since then. These political decisions don't reflect the will of the people of Bahrain. And so there has been an ongoing tension between the population in Bahrain and between the ruling family. And I think a good example of that is that the very short-lived parliament that we had in the 1970s after the British withdrew. I mean, Bahrain stopped being a protectorate, but the British never really fully withdrew. Was that, this parliament, after being in session for 2 years, decided that they did not want to renew the lease for the US military base. And as such, the emir at the time, this king's father, declared a state of national emergency for the next 25 years. And one of the main reasons was because they didn't want to renew the lease for the US military base. And so when you take that into context and the fact that the Bahrainis have been protesting against this for a very long time, have been protesting against the Al-Khalifas for a very long time, for the oppression, for the crackdown, for the violence, the lack of any basic and fundamental human rights, I think it only makes sense that we continue to see the protests that we're seeing now.
And to bring it to what's been going on over the last few weeks, we've seen that Bahrain has particularly come under fire from Iranian attacks, more so than I think the UAE has had the most attacks, and Bahrain is up there. Why do you think that is? And can you tell us a little bit about the historical relationship between Bahrain and Iran?
Yes, of course. I mean, Bahrain had a good relationship with the Shah, unsurprisingly, before the revolution in Iran in 1979. And after that, because of the revolution and because of the new government in Iran, the relationship did not continue to be as it used to be. And so what we see with Bahrain is this, they've always chosen to try and paintbrush the entire opposition as being whatever they think the threat of the day for the West is. And so in the 1920s, it was Nasser socialists, and then it was communists, and then Iranian agents after the Iranian Revolution. And now we see both Iranian agents as well as terrorism being used as a way to paintbrush all of the opposition or anyone who's critical towards the government. And the terrorism law in Bahrain is so vaguely defined that even the work of a human rights defender can be considered terrorism under the definition of the terrorism law that we have in Bahrain. And so, when we look at it from that perspective, and it's we look at how there have been, crackdown after crackdown. We've had uprisings in Bahrain almost every 10 years. But the government, especially after the 1950s, which was another uprising that we had at that time, they decided to create the sectarian separation within the country because at that point, I think they realized that if the Shias and Sunnis, the indigenous population of Bahrain, remains united against the ruling family, that they wouldn't be able to last, especially if the British were to withdraw. And that's when they started to very intentionally create a separation between the Sunnis and the Shias. There are unwritten laws about where Shias can live, where they can rent, what jobs they can work in. They started to politically naturalize tens of thousands of Sunnis from Yemen, Syria, Jordan, Pakistan, and so on, who they bring to the country, give citizenship upon arrival, and a job in the military or police. And so they've created this, private army that is loyal to the ruling family that they use to crack down on the indigenous population of the country. And they do this with the backing of the West. I mean, when you look at the reactions from the Western governments in regards to 2011 and all the 2011 uprisings that happened across the region, you'll see that there's quite a difference between how they responded to Bahrain versus other countries, especially with the entrance of the GCC Peninsula Shield and forces that were brought in to crack down or help crack down on the protests in Bahrain. You saw, Hillary Clinton at the time, who was the Secretary of State, coming out and saying that Bahrain has the sovereign right to invite foreign armies into their country to help crack down on a peaceful uprising. And so there has been this prolonged experience as a Bahraini, this prolonged experience of, the oppression coming from the ruling family themselves, the very clear and intentional sectarianism that they're trying to create within the country to divide and conquer, and then the backing of the West and the enabling that the West provides to the Bahraini regime to be able to continue to do what they're doing, to continue to crack down. But I think more specifically right now on what's happening with the war on Iran, by Israel and the United States. I mean, the Bahrainis have not been shy to talk about their relationship with Israel and their relationship with the Americans. I mean, in 2022, there's a video of a Bahraini official talking very openly at the Munich Security Conference, I believe, about how the Bahraini government is actually actively cooperating with the Mossad and receiving members of the Mossad in Bahrain. And I wouldn't be surprised if Israeli intelligence techniques and tools are being used to target Bahraini human rights defenders and activists. And then they also talked about, the king's son spoke at the Aspen, I think it's called the Aspen Security Conference, where he also talked openly about how they were the first line of defense against Iran to protect Israel and the United States. And so when the Bahraini regime, the ruling family, is so openly saying that, they are pretty much a proxy for the United States, and they're out here defending the Israelis and working with the Mossad, I think, that explains a lot in regards to the Iranian reaction to the Bahrainis and the American installations within Bahrain.
Yeah. And you've said that over the decades, the kind of accusation has changed in terms of how protesters or critics are painted. So what we've seen over the last few days among some of those that have been arrested is accusations of sympathies with Iran or even directly helping Iran or the IRGC. How do you assess some of these charges that we've seen in recent days?
I mean, look, we've been hearing from the Bahraini regime that we have pro-Iranian cells and Hezbollah cells and terrorist cells and so on for decades. I mean, every time there's something in Bahrain that the government needs to use as a narrative for a crackdown, or when they want to target the Shia indigenous population and so on, we see yet another claim that there is a terrorist cell. What we haven't seen, though, is real evidence showing that this is true. I mean, we've seen time and time again, even some of Bahrain's own allies come out and say that this is not true. I mean, even in the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry that was, created and paid for by the king, they talked about how the claims by the Bahraini government about how involved Iran is in the Bahraini uprising of 2011 was actually inaccurate. And so this is something that isn't new to us as Bahrainis, to see the government yet again coming out with these accusations and these claims. Where I think the focus needs to be is the fact that we now have an individual, 32 years old, Sayyid Mohammed al-Musawi, who spent 12 years of his life, from the time he was 18 until he was 30, in prison as a political prisoner, was released at the age of 30, and now at the age of 32 has been tortured to death after being subjected to enforced disappearance for several days. The other 5 people who were arrested with him are still subjected to enforced disappearance, and we have no idea what their situation is and whether they will end up with the same fate as Sayyid Muhammad al-Musawi. And so what the regime is doing is, instead of having used the war on Iran and what's happening in the region as an opportunity to unite the country, they're actually taking it as an opportunity to crack down harder on the Bahraini population, on civil society, on human rights defenders, on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, and so on. And like you mentioned in the beginning, we have hundreds of people arrested in Bahrain as well for merely, stating their opinions or participating in protests. And I think, and I'll end with this, but I think it's also important to remember that when we talk about, people's opinions and who supports Iran, and is it true that they support Iran and so on, who gets to decide who is framed as a terrorist or as committing terrorist acts or terrorism groups and so on, and who doesn't? Right? Who gets to decide that Hezbollah is a terrorist group, but the Israelis are not, that the IDF is not a terrorism group, that the United States military isn't a terrorist group, that the United States government isn't a terrorist group with all the terrorism that they've been doing? So I think there also needs to be a questioning of not just the laws themselves, but the definition of what opinions people are allowed to have. And I think, this is across the board. It's not just in Bahrain. We're seeing it in Bahrain, but in Europe as well. Like, you're only allowed to have certain opinions based on the definitions that Western governments decide of who is a terrorist and who is not a terrorist. In Ukraine, you're a freedom fighter, but in a place like Lebanon or in Palestine, you're considered a terrorist.
And just to end my final question, I wanted to ask you, do you think the anti-government sentiments that we've seen in Bahrain could spread to other parts of the Gulf, or do you think the Bahraini context is quite unique?
I do think that the Bahraini context is unique. I mean, our political and socioeconomic makeup within the population is very different to the rest of the Gulf. Bahrain's economy was struggling even before the war started. And what's going to happen to it the longer this war goes on is, it's not going to be a good outcome. And I think, especially because the economy was so bad to begin with, I think we are going to see a further uptick in poverty and unemployment and so on. And that's its own process of something that is not sustainable. We had the uprising of the activists in 2011. I think the next uprising is going to be the uprising of the hungry. And those are two very different realities. So I think that's one part of it. But I also think that, there is a lot of anti-Western sentiment in the GCC and in the region generally. But you're not going to hear about it in the way that people, think that, well, nobody's really criticizing the US, or opinions aren't anti-US and anti-US. Well, people are not allowed to speak in the GCC. You speak, you say something, the next day you're picked up and you're thrown in prison. And so the idea that we know what people in the GCC actually think or what their opinions are, I think is a farce. It's not something that has any basis in reality. I think the only way that we could say that we know what the opinion of people in the GCC is if we had freedom of expression, which we absolutely don't in any of the GCC countries right now.
Maryam al-Khawaja, thank you for joining us today.